Hello and welcome to this week's myNewsWrap, news from the world of SAP, Microsoft, and the world in between. We are basically in the, let's say, second real work week of January of the new year, and the gates of news have opened. So I have quite some stuff today to show you. Let's start with the area of SAP. So, first of all, a blog post or a video tutorial series about DevOps with the SAP Business Technology Platform that was collected by the SAP HANA Academy, namely by Philip Mucklestone and his folks, around using DevOps on the Business Technology Platform, making use of the services that are available within the Business Technology Platform, but also integrating something like Slack, for example, to get notifications, making use of the alert notification service. So quite cool, quite deep dive video series around the topic of DevOps with the SAP Business Technology Platform. Then let's switch to Kyma. There is also one blog post by a colleague of mine, Gaurav Abi, who highlights how to use the SAP Cloud SDK on Kyma in order to connect to external systems, making use of the so-called destination service, and then authenticating via client-cert authentication. Now, I've referenced within the show notes the blog post of Gaurav, but you have to go to I think the most valuable stuff is within the working sample available in the SAP sample repository on GitHub, which shows you all the bits and pieces and how they work together. I think quite standard scenario and quite useful to have some templates around that in order to see how things work out, making use of Cloud SDK and basic services of the SAP Business Technology Platform. Then there is one new episode on the Coffee Corner radio podcast that was announced quite some time ago. But now it's available since this week on the episode 57 around open source in the SAP ecosystem. So open source currently a big topic, of course, especially due to Log4j, I guess. There is a lot of discussion around licensing. But this one more shows a broader view on the open source, focusing on the SAP ecosystem. And there are lots of guests in there, so the usual community suspects like Lars Wam, Volker Busek, Morten Whitrock, and also Sebastian Wolf, who is part of the open source office at SAP. So if you're interested in the topic of open source at the SAP ecosystem, then this is definitely an episode for you. With that, let's switch to the Microsoft part of the house. So first of all, there was a small announcement around the new extension bundles that are available. And I want to highlight one thing there. This new release of the extension bundles does not only have upgrades, but there is now also an extension for Webhub Sub. So you can now also use Webhub Sub bindings within your Azure functions. That's, I think, really cool. Then I have quite some blog posts by Marcel L. I had a blog post of him, I think, in the last or in the session before. I would highly recommend really to follow him on DevTO, because he is pushing out a lot of great content around Azure functions and around DevOps on Azure. I'm also using Terraform. I have picked out 3 blog posts of him around Azure functions. All very interesting topics, all very important topics. For example, first one, protecting secrets in Azure functions using Key Vault. Very interesting topic. The blog post guides you through how to set things up. What I really like within every blog post is the setup is done via ASAT CLI. So it's not just clicking around or having some screenshots from the portal, but really setting it up as you would do it. And then showing how to bring things together and how to implement things. Now that will become really interesting when the automatic key rotation is also in place, which, as far as I have seen on Twitter, makes a bit of problems with Azure functions at the moment, but hopefully that will be sorted out. Then another blog post by Marcel around email notifications with Azure Functions, making use of Twilio's SandGrid, also a classical scenario from my perspective. Again, great walk through this topic. So if you have some scenario like that, these are the blog posts that really will help you. And last but not least, 3 blog posts by one person in one episode. That's not too often. Powering on and off of virtual machines on Azure, making use of Azure Functions, of course, then with the PowerShell flavor. Again, a great scenario showcasing how you can use these serverless functionalities in order to do DevOps, which makes perfect sense. Then let's switch to durable functions. There is one really cool offering by Massimo Bonanni, who published an ebook around Azure Durable Functions. And this ebook is completely free. So you can download that. You do not even have to key in your contact data or something like that. Just download it. It covers topics around Azure Durable Functions and also Azure Durable Entities. So it's really quite comprehensive. And yeah, if you're starting your journey with Azure Durable Functions, I would highly recommend to take a look at this book and start with it. Then an announcement by Konstantin Lepeshenkov, founder, creator of the Azure Durable Functions Monitor, which is a really super useful tool, which was recently migrated to the official Microsoft GitHub repository. And he now improved also the documentation, which, well, yeah, fair point to improve it from my perspective. I have referenced the announcement tweet and also the GitHub repository in the show notes, namely the wiki, where you really get now guided through the tool and all the features that it has. So now the entry barrier is really low for that topic. Then let's continue and let's switch a bit towards Azure Static Web Apps and Functions. There is a video by Mark Dücker, founder of the Azure Functions University, showcasing his, onboarding task that he had, implementing an app. He did an Agile Flash app, so collaboration tooling, making use of Azure Functions, of course, Azure Static Web Apps, and they're using Vue as a framework and also using Apply in order to glue things together. There is the YouTube video that I've referenced within the show notes that you can take a look at, where he guides you through that Agile Flash thingy in 5 minutes. And there is also a blog post that backs those things up and gives you more insights on what Mark did there in this little showcase. Then, one last thing, one announcement from Azure Static Web Apps. There is a public preview for a new functionality called Enterprise Grade Edge. That's kind of an addition to the functionality that's already there within Azure Static Web Apps with respect to having Azure Front Door functionality, having a more CDN functionality, having some enhanced protection against distributed denial of service attacks. So this is kind of an add-on to the great functionality that's already there within Azure Static Web Apps. If you are interested in that, I highly recommend to go to the additional information that is linked within the release note, because you really have to sort things out. So I think it's a nice addition, but you really have to wrap your head around what's the addition and if you really need that addition in order to optimize your reliability of your website, if that's really your case, or if this is something that's not needed by you, because it comes at an extra price, of course. Then, switching to the world of containers and Kubernetes, let's make the curve not super steep. So starting with the serverless edition, the Azure Container Apps, there is a new edition of the Azure Podcast, episode 407, about container apps. It's available on Apple Podcast. There is also a video podcast that's referenced within the link that I have shared in the show notes, and some additional resources that you can gather there all around Azure Container Apps, how they work, what are typical use cases. If you want to dive deeper into that topic, there is also a YouTube playlist that I would recommend, which is all around Azure Container Apps by Gerd Baker, with 3 videos that gives you a very good introduction into Azure Container Apps, building microservices, deploying them, scaling them, and how to work with the revision feature of Azure Container Apps, which is a very nice thingy and I think quite useful, and allows you to, well, handle multiple revisions of the same app within your deployment. Now with that more serverless container thingy, let's switch to the hardcore Kubernetes area, namely to a functionality that will replace Azure Active Directory pod identity. So if you have been using AKS, there was a functionality called Azure AD pod identity, which should enable your pods to assess resources within Azure in a secure manner, namely mediated by the Azure Active Directory. This AD pod identity is, to the best of my knowledge, in beta, and it will never get out of beta because it will be replaced by the AD workload identity, where I have referenced the GitHub repository within the show notes, which will serve the same goal. So it should enable you to access resources in a secure manner, making use of Azure Active Directory, and making use of service accounts that are specifically annotated in order to hook your things together. The GitHub repo has the basic information and links to further information around that topic. So if you're using AKS, I think that's really super interesting to see how to handle those things. Then, GitHub has started to work again, at least from the news perspective. So this week I got tons of news from the GitHub side. I curated a bit. So first of all, NPM topic. That was announced, I think, at the end of last year, that security improvements are on their way for NPM, especially around two-factor authentication. And this is now a new release note that I've referenced, that these improvements are going on around two-factor authentication, around managing two-factor authentication, especially for organizations, and how things will evolve. So if you are using NPM, not only consuming, but providing packages, and if you are using NPM as an organization, take a look at the release note and the referenced information in there, because there is a lot of stuff that you can now do around security, and this will go on. Then also code spaces got a bit of improvement there, especially when you are an organization. So you can now create organization policies for code spaces in order to restrict the machine types per repository. So you can say, for repository A, I only allow 2 core and 4 core machines, and for another repository, I allow 4 core and 16 core machines, and that's now doable via the organization policies, which makes perfect sense. And this is just the first step, so there will be further improvements in order to allow you to organize those machine types better, more fine granular with your code spaces. Then GitHub Actions got an update with respect to the jobs running on Windows latest. So if you have tagged your build job that to run on Windows latest, you will now be running on Windows Server 2022. This means that the software stack has changed a bit, and the release note that I've referenced within the show notes shows you what has changed, and also has a reference to the list of changed software. Then also in the area of GitHub Actions, something that was a gap, I would say. With GitHub Actions, you could kind of trick a bit, and using actions satisfy the required approval branch protection. So with GitHub Actions, you could simply kind of trigger your action, and then this required approval got done. and you could merge those stuff without having a real approval on your repository or on your branch. And now GitHub brought in a new functionality that you can, it's enabled by default, so you have to disable it, yeah. So that GitHub Actions no longer count as a required approval. So that's, I think, quite helpful. Then a deprecation announcement around GitHub. Git.io, which is a link shortener that was available on GitHub, is no longer accepting new URLs. So you can no longer create new URLs. Existing URLs that you have shortened with Git.io are still available, but be aware that this service will be deprecated in the future. So move to other shorteners if you have been using that one. Then 2 blog posts that are more food for the brain around the GitHub area. First of all, a blog post around how GitHub manages to ship GitHub Mobile every week. And if you're using GitHub Mobile, it's not just bug fixing and performance improvements, but it's really pushing new functionality in a quite decent manner. So if you want to take a look at how the engineering team does that, I think they exemplify via the iOS pipeline. Yeah. Then take a look at this blog post. And then another blog post around the functionality of discussions on GitHub. This blog post highlights how 5 open source communities use this GitHub discussion features in order to facilitate their community. Yeah, so then let's move on to the, further announcements around Microsoft. There is one blog post that I would like to highlight around protecting APIs with the Azure API management, namely using OAuth 2.0 client credential flow. I think a very standard functionality, standard use case, but yeah, as everything within API management, not super easy to achieve if you're not an expert. So highly appreciated that there is a blog post that guides you really through all the steps, what you have to do. And you can then build upon that one. That's really cool. And then if you're using Blazor, there is another website that I would like to highlight to you. It's called buildonblazor.net, which is a curated overview or a showcase of sites that are built on Blazor. You can add your site. There is, I think, no real flow behind. So you can really see what's all possible and who is already using Blazor WebAssembly or Blazor per se for their websites and what's possible there. So it started not too long ago, but there is already quite some amount of pages that showcase what's possible with Blazor. So if you're in the .NET ecosystem and you like that notion of back and front end using the same functionality, the same programming language, then that's really interesting to see what's possible there. Yeah, with that, let's switch to the world in between SAP and Microsoft. What's that there going on? First of all, of course, as every week, the SAP on Azure podcast, the video podcast, this time around focusing around the deployment of SAP systems making use of Azure DevOps, walking you through how to deploy that, how to set up your DevOps, including all the nice and neatly things like a HANA database and so on. So really, I think in general, interesting, but of course, again, more infrastructure things. Then finally, Bartosz Jakowski made it possible. He did it, and all his blog posts around extracting SAP data to Azure are now available on the Microsoft Tech community. So those blog posts that have been banned by the SAP community, and I'm not getting tired to say that was one big mistake from my perspective, are now available on the Microsoft Tech community, so you can all read them now there. So all the information is up and running again. I have referenced the LinkedIn announcement of Bartosz, where he referenced all the different parts of his blog post series. Then another blog post by Martin Pankratz, this time on the SAP community, continuing his series around the BTP private link service on SAP BTP. And this blog post is really something that I especially like because it highlights the case where you can use BTP private link in order to connect to, let's say, platform as a service offerings with respect to database services available on Azure that you would like to use on the business technology platform, like a MySQL, like a PostgreSQL. And this scenario guides you through that, what you have to do in order to make things work. As usual, decent description. There is also a GitHub repository backing that. So that's really interesting if you want to combine those things together, because I think there is a lot of use cases that would like to do that. Now, let's move on to learning and events. There are two blog posts that are, well, more food for your brain. First one is by Container Solutions around their What the Fuck series, so WTF. And this time WTF is an open source license anyway. So again, picking up the discussion that's going on around open source and how companies might abuse licenses that foster this abuse in the open source community. This time picking up Elasticsearch and their journey with AWS. Okay, interesting read, picking up exactly the same topics that Gola Roden pointed out in the video that I've referenced last edition this year. Then another blog post, different topic by Chris Reddington, but I think being 2 years in a global pandemic and having a lot of folks in the technology area doing home office, it's a blog post about mental health and depression. So Chris Reddington obviously had some issues there, and he now kind of came back. And this blog post highlights kind of what happened over the course of, I think it was the last 1.5 years, that put him down and what were his challenges. And I think that's really an important topic to read, and super thankful for Chris to publish something like that openly, because I think that's also a hurdle to overcome. Not only for oneself, but also for co-workers that might suffer under that condition. So really highly appreciated to read that, and it's a super extensive blog post, really guiding you through that topic and how Chris got through those things. Then one event announcement that I would like to highlight around the Software Architektur TV, which is a regular stream around software architecture topics, mainly in German, with some guests in English. And the next edition, which will take place on Wednesday, the 19th, so next week, there is an edition where Eberhard Wolf will have as a guest Sam Newman, and they will discuss the topic monolith to microservices, which will really be definitely an interesting topic. So that's really an event that's worth to watch. Anyway, if you cannot make it, it will be available on YouTube afterwards. And then last thing for today, developer productivity. One thing that I would like to highlight, because I didn't know that, is about Winget. So the tool that you can use on Windows, which kind of works like Chocolate, but is provided by Windows, or also distributed by Windows Store, which allows you to install and update components, and that also allows you to do kind of a batch update or a update all functionality of your software on your computer. And in difference to Chocolate, it kind of fetches also manually installed packages. So I didn't know that. That's of course cool, because if you then want to update a lot of things on your computer, I don't think that it will catch everything, but this is really a functionality that you should take a look at if you think it's necessary to get an update again on your system tools. Now, with that, I'm through with today's session. I hope I had some news for you. There was quite some news that piled up in the last week. So enjoy walking through it, enjoy watching the videos. And yeah, with that, I see you next week. Have a nice Saturday, have a great Sunday, and a successful next week. Until then, bye.